Welcome to CEOs Executive Lunch. Today we are talking to Cameron Jonhson. Cameron has been 20 years in China, 8 years with Microsoft, 7 years as Asia General Manager of Sigma Tech, and recently he joined Tidalwave in the HR and consulting departments. He also been a former member of American Chamber of Commerce. So welcome, Cameron, to this conversation.
Thank you. It's good to be here, and I appreciate you having me.
What is the reason you've been so long in China? It was like a love at first sight. Can you explain a little bit about your career during these years?
Sure. Well, first, I wanted to thank you and Siebes for hosting me. It's great to be here and a part of this program. I came to China in 1999 at the age of 19 for a year and basically never left, with maybe a little short period of time back in the States to finish education. And part of it was, I think being so young, it kind of grew on me. But the other was just the opportunity that I saw. In those early years, teaching English and history at a university up in northeastern China, then coming to Shanghai, getting into Microsoft. At the time in the early 2000s, it really was still very much a frontier in terms of business opportunity. So as I started to grow into my career, there were a few times I tried to go back to the States or even to Europe, but every time I did that, those opportunities failed. So when I tried again in China, I always got new opportunities. So I think part of it for me really has been just the opportunities here that I've been able to take advantage of, but also being fortunate to be in the right time at the right place in terms of growing in an industry, whether it was technology with Microsoft or in carbon fiber manufacturing as it was with Sigma-Tex.
Now, my next question is about your time at Microsoft. Currently, we are talking, and it's in the media, about all this digital conflict between US, China, and in a way, we are creating like a digital wall between the two worlds. You think this will increase in the future?
I think for now, what we're seeing is an acceleration of that. Some call it decoupling, I call it bifurcation, basically the separating of two systems. But we also have to realize this is the 21st century. You can't really do that in a global society, which we are now. So what you do see also is incredible misunderstanding, I think, on both sides. On the Chinese side, you see innovation and technology, particularly in the areas of fintech, ByteDance, TikTok, for example, WeChat, Alipay. These are things that don't exist anywhere else in the world, particularly in the West. And I think when you look at Western companies and countries, they see that and they don't necessarily understand it. I don't know if they view it strictly as a threat, but they really don't understand that. So what we're going to see is continued acceleration, but at some point, I think there will be a bridge divided, whether it's a new app that comes along, a new technology that essentially closes that gap again.
So you don't envision that countries besides US and China, they have to choose in which world they want to operate?
For probably the next decade or two, they may have to. They may have to bifurcate. But again, this is the 21st century. At some point, we're going to have to come back again because business, technology, data, all will demand that we do so.
Experience that we have about technology companies coming to China is that many of them fail. I'm thinking of the case of Uber, Best Buy, and even the problems of Facebook to enter the China market. However, Microsoft seems to do quite well. Why do you think is that difference? What are they doing that is different from the others?
Microsoft came into China in the early to mid-90s, and they had several things going for them. The first was they had the richest man in the world at its helm. And at the time, Bill Gates was idolized as the entrepreneur everybody wanted to be. So that was the first advantage that Microsoft had. The second is they were smart in opening up what's called the Microsoft Research Asia Center in Beijing that really became kind of the technology school for a large portion of China's own technology companies. For example, the CEO of ByteDance spent some time there, as did the CTO of Alibaba. So most of the heavy names that currently exist or run Chinese technology companies have some relationship with Microsoft and or the Microsoft Research Asia. Secondly, they took the approach of we're going to hire people who actually know what they are talking about and can help us bridge some of these divides. For example, they hired Henry Kissinger to bridge some of those gaps, particularly in the late 90s, early 2000s, with the government. In some ways, they partnered with the government to really co-develop policy, to understand exactly where the government was going, how can we as a Microsoft platform meet their needs. And remember, in China, user and market share was never Microsoft's problem. It was always revenue and piracy. And at one point in the early 2000s, the revenue of the state of California in the US was more than the revenue of all of China. So, but again, partnering with the local officials, changing their software packages, offering lower cost services, which they didn't do anywhere else in the world but China. And then when you move forward to about a decade ago, again, they designed a search tool, Bing, to be very China specific in Chinese. They also designed LinkedIn to meet with local standards. So what you saw really was attack at customization and a partnering with the market and with government, where other companies may not necessarily have taken that approach.
I'm also very interested in your experience as an entrepreneur. You spent so many years working for big corporations, and then you decided to join this startup in a way as a partner. What was the reason for that decision?
I think part of it was the new challenge. And so when I decided to do something else, I wanted to do something that gave me the flexibility to still be in touch with, for example, the technology side, because of my work at Microsoft. So, for example, we work with a lot of startups, particularly in the technology area. Some of them also in the government space. And at the same time, because of my carbon fiber background, I wanted to be sure that I could also have a hand in supply chains, industrial, companies, manufacturing. And so being with a company like this kind of allowed me to scratch all those itches at the same time, but also small enough where I could dictate in many ways where we went as a company in the consulting space, which direction we wanted to go. Do we want to focus more on technology? Do we want to focus more on supply chains? Do we want to be a hybrid of both? And I really appreciated that opportunity so that I can focus on driving that business forward.
What are the challenges that you are facing as an entrepreneur in general? What is your experience?
Many of the challenges now are simply just the market is moving so fast. When you talk with customers and clients, often we'll put forward a proposal and advise them you have essentially 1 to 2 weeks to make a decision. Because by the time, if you wait a month or 2 months, which is often the case in other countries, the market would have changed. And then we'll have to start again in the process. The second really is just, it's a different part of work. Being in a corporation, you kind of understand exactly what's expected of you. You have certain KPIs and goals to meet, certain revenue targets. But as an entrepreneur, in many ways, you dictate that yourself. And so I think, again, this is part of my new challenge of learning how to really balance that between, having a family life and at the same time, how do I really push the business forward?
I want to ask you a question that is connected with your experience as supply chain in your previous company. A lot have been said lately about the exodus of manufacturing companies outside of China. However, you mentioned somewhere that you see now a different trend. You see that some companies are moving from Vietnam back to China. Why is that?
The overall trend is that manufacturing companies and supply chains really are not moving from China.
Okay.
And if they are, it's on the periphery. Most companies, for example, Mercedes-Benz is actually doubling down in China. They're putting more investment into China. Their global revenues is 30% from China, whereas, for example, in Germany, it's 15%. In cases with Vietnam, a lot of what's happening is companies had initially gone to Vietnam or other Southeast Asian countries because it was cheaper labor. But what happened when they actually started manufacturing is there are other challenges. For example, infrastructure is a huge challenge in Southeast Asia, as well as labor challenges. The work efficiency isn't as high as in China. Government apparatus are not as mature as China, because again, China's been doing this for over a generation. So those are some of the challenges. There's also the geopolitical challenge, which is Chinese company being in Vietnam. That's challenging in itself. And then beyond that, what you really get into is the ecosystem. China, in most supply chains for most industries, has a fairly mature ecosystem. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. So when governments or companies say we want to move to Mexico, or we want to go to Vietnam, or we're going to Eastern Europe, that may be true, but primary manufacturing will still stay in China. So what we're seeing now is what's called the hub and spoke, where they will have a hub of manufacturing, for example, in China. Maybe it's a primary facility, and then they'll have satellite manufacturing facilities or capability in like a Vietnam or Thailand or Mexico. So if China does go down, they can still support the business.
Oh, very good. My next question is about innovation in China. In the past, I remember that many accused China of copying. But now it seems China is becoming an innovation hub. Do you agree with that?
I do. I think copying in many ways was the beginning of much of business here. But at the same time, that was decades ago. Does it still happen on occasion? Absolutely. But what you really see, particularly in the technology space, is China and Chinese companies are at the forefront of business model innovation globally. When you take a look at Luckin Coffee, although we know the challenges they've had, they pushed Starbucks to do delivery. Starbucks did not do delivery or have an effective APP before Luckin Coffee came along. So Luckin Coffee essentially changed the trajectory of one of America's most famous companies globally. And now if you look at how the app is used in the States, it's essentially like the Chinese version, except catered to American taste. This would not have happened if Luckin Coffee wasn't around a couple years ago to push them. With that, you have, of course, WeChat and Alipay. These don't exist in the West. And when you see a Snap or a Facebook try to emulate, or Apple try to do Apple Pay, these are all ideas and innovations that came from the Chinese side.
You know that CRBI's Business School, we have our MBAs students. What advice could you give them to find a job in this country?
I think there's really three things. The first is network, 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 network. Your success, particularly in Asia, will be dictated about who you know. In the West, that is the case somewhat, but really relationships, or guanxi as we say here in China, is really the grease of business in this region. The second is join a professional organization. I'm a member of the American Chamber of Commerce here in Shanghai. I have been since 2004. And outside of my professional working career, it's given me some of the most incredible opportunities I've ever had in my life. For example, I've been fortunate to go to Congress, the US Congress, and talk about Chinese carbon fiber as an example. That would never have happened had I not been a member of AmCham. And really third, management will dictate how far you go in your career. If you have a good manager who pushes you, who mentors you, who teaches you, who cares about your success, you will go very far. And if you have a manager who just cares about the numbers, your career won't go very far in that particular region. So I would take those three: networking, professional organizations, and management.
And what about entrepreneurship? You are a foreigner, an entrepreneur. Is that easy to be a foreigner and start your own company?
It is challenging, partly because the rules are always evolving. And this is something, though, I think is a blessing in China. China, in many ways, moves much faster with its laws and with its guidelines, for example, than in the US. Oftentimes in the US, it will take years to get something together. In China, that isn't necessarily the case. So in some ways, having a company here and a business, even though regulations can change, I think is in many ways more effective because I know where the road is heading. I know the direction they're going. And sometimes in the US or in Europe, that isn't always the case. So for me, the biggest challenges would be really understanding that road and also, again, forging those relationships with key stakeholders. Here, the government is your partner and a key stakeholder of your business, no matter what. So if you don't have that relationship and understanding, your business is going to struggle.
They are talking about is the innovation in China. And one area that seems that Chinese are very strong in innovation is in supply chain, finding new ways, more than basic innovation or scientific innovation. What is your experience about that topic?
So when you look at current trends, China, and again, this is with the business model innovation, Chinese companies often will take risks that others won't. For example, in designing automotive parts, oftentimes when you see a traditional Western company, to do a new part, they would have to design it, prototype it, build it, test it, and then repeat the process again and again until it's perfect. Oftentimes that can take a very long time, sometimes several years. But what we found is Chinese companies, for example, particularly with materials, they'll order everything at once, and then they will just test all of that at the same time. So the lead time and the development actually is cut sometimes by 50 to even 80%, because they're willing to just take the chance and lose money in the beginning in order to perfect the product or part or even the technology on the back end. So that's one innovation. The second really is just the ecosystem we talked about earlier. The ecosystem for development here doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. So for example, let's say you're making a prototype part. You don't have a particular widget or a screw or a piece. You can call your cousin's brother's friend's sister, who probably lives in the next province, who's making something similar to meet your need. That doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. Also, the amount of time it takes to build molds, to put things together, to hire an expert to come in. All of this almost happens instantaneously in terms of the production time. So as a supply chain, it actually shortens the time from actual design to producing large-scale mass parts.
I remember you mentioned that when you arrived to China, there was in a way, like the Wild West. Everything was open, everything was needed. China has changed a lot since then. Their local competitors are stronger, the Chinese consumer are more sophisticated. Do you think that is still a place in the market for foreign companies?
I think foreign companies are a key component of the market. Okay. And part of that really is bringing a different perspective, a diversity of thought. Things are done differently in the US and Europe and Australia than they are done here. That's not necessarily a bad thing. And I think really when you get to companies who bridge those gaps and really understand both how to bring Western know-how, innovation, market ideas into China, you see incredible success. Take Pizza Hut, for example. When they came in, they had a very Western menu. Now they have a very, what we can consider a Chinese menu. They have squid pizza. They have smoked salmon pizza. You don't find this in America. At the same time, when you look at McDonald's, right? McDonald's was the first major Western company to come into China. And I think if you remember, I think it was 1980 when they opened up their first McDonald's in Beijing, and it was called the worst business decision in history. So obviously McDonald's for many years in Asia, particularly China, has held up the business globally, particularly during the financial crisis. So when you see companies that really take and understand the local market and also blend it with the best of their own culture, you see an incredible coming together that makes companies that don't exist anywhere else in the world. You mentioned Microsoft earlier. Microsoft China is one of the best innovators, but also culture builders globally because they've been able to blend all of that together. If you look at Starbucks in China has been able to take its know-how domestically and expand it globally to make itself an overall better business. Right? So these are areas that I think have really been effective, and these are companies that have been really effective in putting both together.
You've been 20 years in China. I suppose you work with many Chinese. What are the things for you are important to connect with your Chinese teams and get the best out of them?
Just really developing that relationship. Particularly as I got later into my career, when I would walk into a room or I'd talk to a team and I'd talk to them in Chinese, and they would go, whoa, you actually know Chinese. And then secondly, when they started to find out more about me, and again, I think many companies and staff, they don't really want to share a lot of personal knowledge, but China's just a different culture. You have to share your personal life, your personal thoughts, because that's what's considered true friendship. Friends share. So if we're really going to be together and be friends, or be in this relationship, we need to share. Particularly as I got later on, you've lived in China so long. You speak Chinese. You can actually use chopsticks in the appropriate way. These kinds of things. It changes the conversation. You're not just somebody who is here for a short-term stint or career to market something on a checklist, but you're really here and invested into the culture and the country. That makes an impact. And then beyond that also, just working with them We had a situation once where there was a large problem at a customer, and I went out with them to go see the customer personally to fix the problem. The previous management hadn't done that. And so it made a big impact, not only on this office staff, okay, this guy's with us. We know we can count on him. We know that he's willing to go the extra mile, but also to the customer. Many of our customers never saw the people they did business with. And I tried to make it a point that regardless of wherever they were, or even if they ordered one piece of material or they ordered everything, that at least once a year they would see my face. And that really made an impact business-wise. And again, it's the relationship. When I would go to their factory, ask about their problems, inquire as to, how can we work together to help solve some of these problems? Well, maybe I know somebody that could help you. It really goes a long way in building those relationships and also being effective overall in the business. So as an entrepreneur, this is some of what I bring in today's world, where I focus on that. I go see a customer. Oh, what's your problem? Oh, I have a problem with a lawyer. Or I have a problem with a customer. Oh, I know somebody who can actually give you some guidance. Let me make a phone call, or in China, a WeChat introduction. And it really helps push that a long way.
Very good. And I suppose that also helps to marry a Chinese?
Sure. It always does.
Okay, so thank you very much for your time. It's been great to have you here, and I hope to see you again in the future.
Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to doing it again.